The Anglo-Indian group started to appear in the social scenario of Bengal from the mid-18th century onwards. Being a mixed racial community, they faced problems socially and economically. The community, despite the negligency, able to grow in number, wealth, and power with the help of Christian missionaries, philanthropy, private schooling, and knowledge of English in the early 19th century. Christian missionaries took help of this community to preach Christianity, which made the condition complicated. Therefore, the East India Company put the restriction on the activity of the missionaries as well as on this community. Despite this, the community could succeed in finding jobs in the offices of the East India Company due to their knowledge of English. Soon, this picture changed from 1840s due to the company's new education policy, which allowed Indian to enter the company's service. The Anglo-Indian society, therefore, lost the opportunity to work in the company's offices, but managed to survive while getting jobs in the new emerging service sectors like railway, telegraph, and customs. The shift in the occupation had affected the group financially, and soon this group of people started to identify it as white poor by the colonial government. This deviation in the job status forced the Anglo-Indian community to migrate to the suburbs like Darjeeling, Assam, and other parts of Bengal. This dislocation from the Kolkata brought several problems to this community. Among them, educating the toddlers was severe. Railway schools were established to address this issue, but these were inadequate in number. Besides, good number of the Europeans moved to Assam and the Darjeeling Hills with the spread of the tea plantation. Union of these Europeans with the local women and the tea gardens women laborers gave birth to the first generation of the Anglo-Indian community in the area. This newborn community was ostracized by the local people and the European planters. Thus, they suffered due to poverty, lack of education, and identity. Despite this suffering, soon Darjeeling Hill became a shelter for the Anglo-Indian people where they could able to find a home to nurture their souls. The paper, while bringing all these issues under speculation, discusses how the Darjeeling Hills become a home for the Anglo-Indian community and if the Anglo-Indian community could able to accept Darjeeling Hills as their new home. Besides, the paper tries to find out how did the indigenous people of the hills and the British Raj look at this identity formation in the Darjeeling Hills and if any new kind of developments started in the hills with the coming of the Anglo-Indians. The paper has been divided into two parts to discuss all these nuances. The first part focuses on the process of building up the connection between the Anglo-Indian community with the Darjeeling Hills, and the second part of the paper highlights the interaction between the Anglo-Indians with the local people and the Europeans. The connection between the Anglo-Indian community with the Darjeeling Hills was built up through education, migration, and tea plantation. Until 1858, the British government turned a blind eye to the condition of the Anglo-Indian community. After that, 1858, the colonial government considered educating the domicile community as their moral obligation. Thus, the British government formulated an official educational plan for the Anglo-Indians and the European children through the Cunning Minutes in 1860. Some schools were opened for this two particular community while following the Cunning Minutes. Besides, the growing poverty among the Anglo-Indian community became a point of humiliation for the British colonial government. Thus, the government took punitive and reformative measures to shield the empire from this humiliation. On one hand, passing of the European Vagrancy Act of 1869 was one of such punitive measure taken to restrict the movement of these white poors and the vagabonds in the public domain. On the other hand, some reformative stand had been taken to rescue these poor people, especially children and the young people. This initiative were providing education and employment to the community. Therefore, the colonial government planned to establish schools for the Anglo-Indians. This was the Lord Lytton who started this initiative, and it was carried out by the other viceroys as well. As a result, three kinds of schools were opened to educate the Anglo-Indian community: government-aided European school, private school, and the railway schools. And the fundamental principles were like keeping Christian character and European tone in view. Following this measure, several schools were opened in the Darjeeling Hills. After that, the missionary schools were also opened by the Scottish missionaries, and these schools attracted many European boys and the girls from the plains and the tea garden areas. Later, these schools opened its door for the subalterns. Reverend John Graham was pioneer in this process. Reverend Graham came to Darjeeling Hill in the year 1887, and soon his wife also joined him. Both of them started preaching and philanthropic work in the area. Besides, they used teaching the slum children and heal the local people. Along with the development of reading and writing skills, female students were given lessons in knitting, sewing, conduct, and cooking. It shows that the missionaries were giving importance to the domestic skills rather than the literacy and the numeracy. Girls' schools also opened in the Kalimpong Hill in 1890, which provided training on the handicraft to its students. The school also provided training on carpentry and the rug making to the local Lepcha, Bhutia, and Tibetan men as well. Meanwhile, the government established some other schools for the Anglo-Indians in the Kurseong. The Victorian Boys' School and the Dow Hill schools were two of them. The Scottish mission of Kalimpong, however, identified these steps as inadequate to improve the life of the white poor, especially the orphan Anglo-Indian children of the tea gardens. Thus, John Graham planned to open a home for domiciled Europeans and the Anglo-Indians. The main reason for establishment of this colonial home was first to train the particular community for migration at the other European colonies. Second, Graham found the climate and the surrounding of Kalimpong suitable for the mental and the physical development of the Anglo-Indian and the domiciled European children. Alison Blunt argues that the Graham had chosen Kalimpong to keep the Anglo-Indian children away from the injurious native influence and wanted to train them through the home lives. The training of the Anglo-Indian children started in the Graham colonial home while following these agendas. It has been mentioned that the home gave proper training to the Anglo-Indians so they could migrate to the other British colonies. Thus, the curriculum and the teaching method in the home also prepared accordingly. Students were therefore given lessons on agriculture and carpentry along with the traditional education. Graham took several initiatives to help Anglo-Indian children in their smooth migration to New Zealand. The first batch of Anglo-Indian students migrated to New Zealand in 1908. Jane McCabe argues that the 62 graduates were migrated to New Zealand from Graham colonial home in between 1908 to 1921 and settled in South Island and the lower North Island. Most of these Anglo-Indians were employed as the laborer in the southern farm. However, the Anglo-Indians' dream of settling into the British land was pulverized with the coming of new amendment to New Zealand Immigration Act. The Act declared that a migrant should not be a native of any other colonies and they could only enter the country under the permit system. Reverend Graham was critical about this stand of New Zealand government and proposed that the act should be modified while allowing people not less than 50% of European blood. Thus, a new home immigration scheme has been introduced and under this 52 new graduates migrated to New Zealand in between 1923 to 29. The migration after 1929, however, decreased due to the Great Depression. Besides, no student of the home had been migrated to New Zealand after 1930 due to the strong implication of the Immigration Restriction Act. Reverend Graham wrote a letter to the Custom Department while asking to give work and the residential permit to the Anglo-Indian graduates of the home. In this situation, the government once again turned its eyes to the home once again turned its eyes to educating Anglo-Indian and keeping the students aloof from the ongoing national movement. During the Second World War, many graduates of the home joined British Army. Besides, many of the students went to the Teachers Training Institute at Kalimpong and Kurseong. Local people of the hills and the European response to the Anglo-Indians in the Darjeeling were a bit different from the plains of Bengal. Reverend Graham had chosen Kalimpong for the home because of its climate as well as the openness of the local people. The migrated Nepalis of the areas were free from institution of caste, in having no powerful priesthood, and in being far less bound by the religion. The tea planters also extended financial support to the Graham homes, and many of them had sent their children to the home. Thus, it can be said that the approach towards the Anglo-Indians of the area was quite helpful. Darjeeling Hills Anglo-Indian schools were built up with the government financial help. However, the colonial government agreed to provide financial help to these schools on the condition that 15% of the students in the government aided school should be non-European and non-Anglo-Indians. Thus, this became a point of disagreement between the government and the school authority. The authority argued that the existed number of the schools were already insufficient for the Anglo-Indian and the Europeans. Therefore, the government rule would once again deprive the Anglo-Indian community of education. Besides, they also argued that the non-European parents might question the Christian tone of the school, which may destroy the aim of the school, that is, preparing the loyal citizen while following the truth of Christianity. The colonial government called several meetings to resolve this issue but failed. Ultimately, the government discontinued the grant of the Anglo-Indian and the European missionary school. After that, these schools were sustained with a grant given by the private organization and individual philanthropy. In this condition, the government started boarding grants for the poor and the orphan Anglo-Indian student. The government agenda of starting this grant was to help the Anglo-Indian community and the Indian government, Anglo-Indians and the European school indirectly. The government said that the students with the boarding grant should send to the boarding school and the orphanages. Besides, the government also relaxed its rules for the Anglo-Indian school. For instance, the All India European School Code of 1905, however, prescribed a maximum of 15% of the total number of Indians in the European school. But this restriction either been relaxed or abrogated in most provinces. Therefore, this Anglo-Indian boarding school in the Darjeeling Hills got government grants. In 1924, therefore, Kalimpong home got huge amount of grant from the Bengal legislature. After 1947, the government of India decided to continue the special grant to the European and the Anglo-Indian students for next 10 years. At the same time, the government of India asked the Anglo-Indian school to fulfill the 15% of the seat with non-European students to avail the grant. Despite all this initiative, the Anglo-Indian community in the Darjeeling Hills was started to move out from 1960 onwards. Many of the Anglo-Indians argued that the reason for this migration was losing job due to the government fund cuts of the hill schools and the community's incompetency in Hindi. However, the another reason for this migration may be the existed sense of being ostracized by the both Indian and the European society among the Anglo-Indian, which was further nurtured by the Christian missionaries, especially by Reverend Graham. The aim of the Graham home was to prepare the pupils for migration. Unlike the other Anglo-Indian boarding school, St. Andrew's Calling Home or the Graham Colonial Home trained boys to work at the school's firm in preparation for their immigration from India to Australia or New Zealand. The governor of the schools believed that there were no place for their words in India. Besides, the home did not encourage any direct interaction between home students and the locals. Conclusion: the Anglo-Indian search for a home in the Darjeeling Hill was a successful attempt from 1860 to 1929. During this period, Darjeeling Hill turned into a home for them as they found a safe shelter in the Anglo-Indian boarding school, a chance of isolating themselves from rigid Indian society and preparing themselves to enter into a European world while acquiring education. Besides, the dream of migration to Australia and New Zealand had also rejuvenated the community. This sense of security started to disappear from the life of the Darjeeling Hills Anglo-Indian with the passing of strict New Zealand's Immigration Act and crushed their dream of migration. Anxiety among the community increased when the British government left India while identifying them as an Indian. After independence, the government of India extended support to the Anglo-Indian school. Despite this, the community felt more insecure with the cutting down of the financial assistance and imposition of the studying of Hindi along with the local languages in the Anglo-Indian school. As a result, many Anglo-Indians migrated from Darjeeling. However, several schools were established in the Darjeeling Hills for the betterment of the Anglo-Indian community from mid-19th century onwards, and therefore the area turned into a schooling hub of Bengal. Thank you.